The day Mabel Carter discovered someone had been sabotaging her farm for years, she was standing knee-deep in mud over a broken irrigation pipe that 3 so-called experts had sworn didn't exist. Her hands were bleeding, her son was hungry, and the men who wanted her land dead were probably drinking whiskey in town, celebrating another week closer to her failure. But what those bastards didn't know was that a stranger had just ridden into the valley, someone who could read water like other men read cards, and he was about to burn their entire plan to the ground. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The first thing people noticed about Mabel Carter after her husband died wasn't the dark circles under her eyes or the way her dresses hung looser each month. It was the silence. Thomas Carter had been loud, the kind of man whose laughter carried across 3 fields, whose voice at the grain auction made buyers sit up straighter. When he collapsed in the north pasture one August afternoon, clutching his chest while the hired hand screamed for help that came too late, he took all that noise with him. What he left behind was a 40-acre orchard on the northern edge of the valley, a 9-year-old boy named Eli, and a woman everyone assumed would fail. They gave her 6 months. The orchard had been Thomas's pride. His grandfather planted the first apple trees in 1867, back when this valley was still being carved out of wilderness and hope. 3 generations of Carter men had worked this soil, expanded the acreage, dug the irrigation lines that turned dry ground into something worth fighting for. But something had gone wrong. Mabel first noticed it the summer before Thomas died. The apples came in smaller. The grain in the east field sprouted unevenly, whole patches just refusing to grow. When the autumn rains hit, the west pasture flooded so badly they lost half the feed crop. Thomas blamed the weather, said every farm had bad years. Then he died, and the bad years got worse. By the following spring, sections of the orchard were producing fruit so small and bitter the buyers wouldn't even make an offer. The grain fields cracked open in the summer heat like old leather. After every storm, the west acreage turned into a swamp that took weeks to drain. Mabel hired the first expert in June. His name was Vernon Pike, a man Thomas had trusted, someone who'd consulted on irrigation systems across 3 counties. Vernon spent 2 days walking the property, testing soil, checking the water flow from the mountain creek that fed the entire farm. "Bad luck, Mrs. Carter," he said finally, standing in her kitchen and accepting the coffee she'd made. "Sometimes land just turns on you. Soil gets tired. Water table shifts. Nothing to be done about it." "The irrigation lines?" Mabel asked. "Thomas always said, 'Lines are fine,'" Vernon interrupted. "I checked them myself. Your problem's deeper than pipes." He left that afternoon, charged her $40 for the consultation. Mabel paid him with money she didn't have. The second expert came in August. Carl Bennett, recommended by the bank manager who was starting to make worried noises about the outstanding loan Thomas had taken to expand the grain operation. Carl was younger than Vernon, more aggressive in his assessment. He dug test holes, measured water pressure, made serious faces at his notes. "Soil composition's off," he announced. "You've got drainage issues the lines can't fix. Honestly, Mrs. Carter, this land might be past saving. You ever think about selling, cutting your losses while there's still equity?" "No," Mabel said, "just trying to help." Carl shrugged. "Pride's expensive, but it's your choice." He charged $60 and left her a business card for a land broker. By October, the whispers in town had turned into open conversations. Mabel heard them when she brought Eli to the general store. Women who used to smile at her now exchanged glances over the dry goods. Men who'd bought Thomas's apples for years suddenly had other suppliers. "Shame about the Carter place," someone said behind her while she counted coins for flour. "Heard the orchard's half dead." "That's what happens when a woman tries to run a farm," another voice replied. "No disrespect to the widow, but some things need a man's hand." Mabel paid for her flour and left without looking back. The truth was worse than the gossip. She'd found the problem herself 2 years earlier, before Thomas died, when she'd been trying to figure out why the northwest corner of the orchard kept flooding. She'd followed the irrigation line by hand, walking the buried pipe route Thomas had drawn on an old property map. At the second drainage junction, beneath 3 feet of soil and rock, she'd found the collapse. A 20-foot section of the main line had caved in, probably during a hard freeze years back. The pipe had split, folded in on itself, creating a bottleneck that choked water flow to half the property. Everything downstream was either drowning or dying of thirst, depending on the season. She'd told Thomas. He'd planned to fix it that fall. Then his heart stopped, and the collapse stayed buried. Mabel knew what needed to happen. The entire section had to be excavated, the damaged pipe removed, new lines laid and sealed. It required 3 strong men, 2 weeks of labor, and money she didn't have. Every expert she hired somehow missed it. Vernon Pike had walked right over the junction point and declared the lines fine. Carl Bennett's drainage test should have spotted the pressure drop immediately, but he'd blamed the soil instead. At first, Mabel thought she was wrong. Maybe she'd misread the map. Maybe the collapse had somehow repaired itself. But then the pattern started to make sense. The men who inspected her land always left with the same advice: sell. And they always mentioned the same buyer, a rancher named Douglas Kern, who owned the property south of hers and had been trying to expand his holdings for years. One freezing November morning, Mabel stood at the kitchen window watching Eli feed the chickens in the yard. The boy moved like his father, same long stride, same way of tilting his head when he concentrated. But he was too thin now. They both were. The bank letter sat on the table behind her. Final notice. Payment due. She'd sold Thomas's best horses. She'd let go of the hired hands. She was working the farm alone now, trying to do the job of 4 people, watching the land die a little more each week despite everything she knew about what was killing it. The town expected her to fail. Maybe they were right. Then a stranger rode into the valley, and everything changed. His name was Garrett Hale, though nobody knew that yet. He appeared in town on a cold April evening, riding a tired sorrel mare that had seen better days. He was somewhere in his 30s, tall and weathered in the way of men who'd spent more time outdoors than in. His clothes were worn but clean. His boots had been resoled more than once. He stabled his horse at the livery and paid for 3 nights up front in cash. "Passing through?" the stable hand asked. "Maybe," Garrett said. He took a room above the saloon, the cheap kind that rented by the week to drifters and seasonal workers. Then he went downstairs for supper. The saloon on a Tuesday night wasn't crowded. A few ranch hands playing cards in the corner, 2 older men nursing whiskey at the bar, and a table near the back where Douglas Kern sat with Vernon Pike and another rancher named Hugh Strauss. Garrett took a seat at the bar and ordered stew. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Kern's voice carried, especially after the second round of drinks. "She can't hold out much longer," Kern was saying. "The bank's about to foreclose. Another month, maybe 2. "You sure she won't sell before that?" Hugh asked. "Stubborn woman," Vernon said. "I told her months ago the land was finished. She didn't want to hear it." Kern laughed. "Doesn't matter what she wants to hear. Numbers don't lie. When the bank takes the property, I'll make an offer. 40 acres at foreclosure price. I'll have the whole North Valley." "What about the irrigation issues?" Hugh asked. "What issues?" Kern grinned. "Once I own it, I'll fix whatever needs fixing. Amazing how problems disappear when you know where to look." Vernon and Hugh laughed. Garrett kept eating his stew. But something about the conversation stuck in his mind. The way they talked about the woman's land like it was already theirs. The certainty in Kern's voice when he mentioned fixing problems that supposedly didn't exist. Garrett had spent 15 years working on farms, ranches, and water systems across 5 territories. He knew what land mismanagement looked like. He also knew what sabotage looked like. And he knew the sound of men who were lying. The next morning, he saddled his mare and rode north out of town. The Carter farm wasn't hard to find. It sat at the base of the foothills, where the mountain creek came down through a rocky canyon and spread out across the valley floor. The orchard covered the western slope, rows of apple trees that should have been thick with spring buds but looked sparse and struggling. A woman was working near the barn. She had dark hair pulled back in a braid, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, mucking out a stall with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from doing the same task 1,000 times. She didn't notice him until his horse snorted. She turned, one hand already reaching for the pitchfork. "Can I help you?" Her voice was flat, unwelcoming. "Maybe," Garrett said. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm looking for work. Heard in town someone might need help with irrigation." "You heard wrong." She went back to mucking the stall. "Name's Garrett Hale. I've worked water systems from Montana to—" "Don't care." She didn't look up. "Can't afford hired help." Garrett glanced past her at the orchard. Even from here, he could see the problem. The trees on the northwest slope were yellowing, getting too much water. The ones on the eastern ridge were stunted, not getting enough. Classic signs of a broken main line. "What if I don't charge?" he said. That made her stop. She turned slowly, pitchfork still in hand, and looked at him properly for the first time. Her face was lean, marked with the kind of exhaustion that came from months of fighting a losing battle, but her eyes were sharp. "Nobody works for free," she said. "I just need a place to sleep for a few weeks. Barn's fine. I'll fix whatever's breaking your water flow, then I'll move on." "Why?" "Because I don't like watching good land die when it doesn't have to." Mabel Carter stared at him for a long moment. She'd heard every kind of offer in the past year. Men offering to buy her out. Men offering to manage the farm for a percentage. Men offering to marry her so she wouldn't have to handle things alone. Nobody had ever offered to work for nothing. "You can look," she said finally, "but I'm not promising anything." Garrett nodded. She led him across the property, showing him the grain fields and the pasture, pointing out where the flooding happened and where the soil went dry. She moved like someone who'd walked these acres 10,000 times, who knew every fence post and drainage ditch by heart. When they reached the northwest corner of the orchard, Garrett crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the ground. "This where it floods worst?" he asked. "After every rain," Mabel said, "used to drain fine. Something changed 3, maybe 4 years back." Garrett stood and walked 20 paces east, following a line only he could see. Then he stopped and knelt again, brushing aside dead grass and loose soil. "You got a property map?" he asked. "Something showing where the main irrigation line runs?" Mabel hesitated. Then she pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket, the same map Thomas had drawn, worn soft from handling. Garrett studied it, then looked up at the orchard, calculating angles and distances. "Second junction point," he said quietly. "Right here. This is where your line collapsed." Mabel's breath caught. "That's—" She stopped. "How do you know that?" "Pressure drop, drainage pattern, the way the trees are stressed." He pointed at the map. "You've got a 20-foot section of broken pipe right under our feet. Maybe more. It's choking everything downstream." 3 men inspected this line," Mabel said, her voice harder now. "They all said it was fine." Garrett looked at her steadily. "Then 3 men lied to you." The words hit like a slap. Mabel had suspected it, felt it in her gut every time an expert left with advice that made no sense. But hearing someone say it out loud made it real in a way that twisted something sharp in her chest. "Why?" she asked. "Why would they lie?" "Lot of reasons," Garrett said. "None of them good." He stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "I can fix this. Take me 2 weeks, maybe less if the weather holds. I'll need to excavate the junction, replace the damaged section, reseal the connections. It's hard work, but it's not complicated." "I can't pay you," Mabel said. "Don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" Garrett looked at her. "Honest answer? I don't know yet. I just know I'm not riding away and leaving this broken." Mabel studied his face. She'd learned to spot liars, the hesitation in their eyes, the way they oversold their promises. This man wasn't doing either. He just stood there, waiting, like her decision didn't really matter to him one way or the other. That was what made her believe him. "Barn's open," she said finally. "There's a stall in the back corner that's clean. I'll bring you supper tonight." "Appreciate it. Don't thank me yet." She turned back toward the house. "And don't steal anything. I know exactly what I own." Garrett almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He watched her walk away. This woman everyone in town thought was finished, who'd been fighting alone for months against problems she couldn't fix and men who wanted her to fail. Then he went to get his tools. That night, Mabel brought stew and cornbread to the barn. Garrett had already cleared space in the back stall and set up a bedroll. His saddlebags were neatly arranged, his tools laid out and organized. He'd mucked the other stalls without being asked, and stacked the firewood that had been scattered across the barn floor. "You didn't have to do that," Mabel said, setting down the food. "Wasn't busy." She watched him eat for a moment. He had good manners, didn't gulp his food like some men did, didn't talk with his mouth full. But there was something in the way he moved, a kind of careful control that made her think he'd gone hungry before. "Where you from?" she asked. "Kansas, originally. Haven't been back in years." "Family?" "Not anymore." The finality in his voice told her not to push further. Why'd you really stop here? She asked instead. Town's got nothing special. Farm work's scarce. Garrett set down his spoon. Heard some men talking in the saloon last night about a widow losing her land, about how the bank was about to foreclose and someone named Kern was planning to buy the place cheap. Mabel went very still. They mentioned your name, Garrett continued. Talked about how your irrigation was broken and couldn't be fixed, how the land was cursed. He met her eyes. Funny thing is, they sounded real happy about it. Douglas Kern wants my property, Mabel said quietly. He's wanted it for years. Made Thomas an offer once. Thomas told him no. What happened to Thomas? His heart stopped. She said it without emotion, like she'd said it too many times already. 14 months ago. Garrett nodded slowly. And since then, every expert who's inspected your land has told you it can't be saved. Yes. But you knew different. I found the collapse 2 years ago, Mabel admitted. Told Thomas about it. He was going to fix it, but she trailed off. After he died, I tried to tell the men who came to inspect. They either didn't believe me or said I was wrong. They weren't wrong, Garrett said. They were paid. The words settled between them like stones. Mabel had thought it, suspected it, but hearing someone else confirm what she'd been too afraid to fully believe made her hands shake with something that felt like rage and relief mixed together. I can't prove that, she said. Don't need to prove it. Just need to fix your farm. Garrett picked up his spoon again. Once the water flows right, once your crops come in strong, those men won't matter anymore. And if they try to stop you, then they try. Mabel studied him in the lamplight. You don't talk like a drifter. I am one, though. Why? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Because staying in one place never worked out for me. Easier to keep moving. Until now? I'll leave when the work's done, he said. But something in his voice sounded less certain than his words. Mabel picked up the empty bowl. We start at sunrise. Ground's still half frozen, so the digging will be rough. I've done rough before. She turned to leave, then stopped. Garrett. Yeah? Thank you. The words came out harder than she meant them to. For believing me. He nodded. Get some sleep, Mrs. Carter. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. After she left, Garrett lay in the darkness of the barn, listening to the wind move through the orchard outside. He'd meant what he said about leaving. He always left. But something about this place, about the way that woman carried herself like she was made of iron and exhaustion, about the quiet desperation in her voice when she thanked him for something as simple as belief, made him wonder if this time might be different. In the house, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's old property map spread in front of her. Eli was asleep upstairs. The bank letter was still waiting for a response she didn't have. And outside, in her barn, a stranger who owed her nothing was preparing to do what 3 paid experts had refused to do: fix what was broken. She traced her finger along the irrigation line on the map, following it to the junction point where Garrett said the collapse was waiting. For the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. It scared her more than the failure had, because hope could be taken away. But she'd already lost so much. What was one more risk? She folded the map and went to bed. Tomorrow they would start digging, and one way or another the truth buried beneath her land was about to come to light. The work began before sunrise. Mabel woke Garrett while it was still dark, and together they hauled tools to the northwest corner of the orchard. The ground was hard, frost still locked in the soil despite April's arrival. Every shovel strike rang out like metal on stone. Eli appeared an hour after dawn, wrapped in his father's too large coat. Mama said you're fixing the water, he said to Garrett. That's the plan. Can I help? Garrett glanced at Mabel. She looked like she wanted to say no, to keep her son away from the work, away from the possibility of disappointment. But she just nodded. Stay out of the trench, she said, and do what you're told. Eli's face lit up. For 3 days they dug. The trench had to be 6 feet deep to reach the main line. The walls kept collapsing, sending dirt and rocks sliding back into the hole they'd just cleared. Mabel's hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. Garrett worked with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done hard labor his whole life, never complaining, never stopping except to drink water or check their progress. Eli hauled rocks, cleared debris, and asked 1,000 questions. Why's the pipe break? Freezing and thawing, Garrett explained. Water expands when it turns to ice. If the pipe's old or weak, the pressure cracks it. Why didn't Papa fix it? Garrett paused, then said gently, Sometimes we don't get the time we think we're going to get. On the 4th day, they hit the pipe. It was worse than Garrett had expected. The main line hadn't just cracked. It had collapsed completely. A 25-foot section had caved in on itself, crushed by the weight of soil and frost. The pipe was old, original to the property, and had simply given up. Can you fix it? Mabel asked. Garrett crouched in the trench, running his hands along the damaged section. Need new pipe. At least 30 feet to be safe, plus couplings and sealant. How much? He did the math in his head. $40. Maybe less if I can find used materials. Mabel's face went tight. I don't have $40. I do, Garrett said. No. Mrs. Carter? No. Her voice was firm. I won't take your money. Then how? I'll sell something. She climbed out of the trench. Give me 2 days. She rode into town that afternoon. What she sold, she didn't tell him. But 2 days later, she came back with new pipe sections loaded in a borrowed wagon, along with the couplings and tar sealant they needed. Her wedding ring was gone. Garrett noticed but didn't say anything. They worked through rain, through cold, through nights when the temperature dropped so low, the water in their canteens froze solid. Garrett taught Eli how to measure pipe angles, how to seal connections so they wouldn't leak, how to test pressure before backfilling the trench. Mabel worked alongside them, never asking for breaks, never complaining. And slowly, the new line took shape. By the end of the 2nd week, they were ready to test it. Garrett opened the main valve at the creek junction while Mabel and Eli waited at the orchard. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then water surged through the repaired line. It hit the junction, flowed clean through the new section, and spread out across the irrigation network exactly the way it was designed to. The northwest corner of the orchard, dry and dying for years, suddenly had water again. Eli whooped and ran between the trees, watching the ditches fill. Mabel stood motionless, staring at the water like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Garrett walked up beside her. It'll take a few weeks to see the difference in the trees, but the flow's good now. Everything downstream should recover. She didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly. You were right. About what? The men who inspected this land. They knew. Her voice was shaking, not with sadness, but with anger. They knew exactly what was wrong, and they lied to my face. Yeah, Garrett said. They did. Why? She turned to him. What did I ever do to them? Nothing. That's the point. You didn't do anything wrong. They just wanted your land, and you were in the way. Mabel's hands clenched into fists. Douglas Kern. Probably, Garrett agreed. Can't prove it, but the pattern fits. I want to. Want to what? Prove it. Her eyes were hard now. I want everyone to know what they did. Garrett understood the impulse, but he'd seen enough of the world to know how these things worked. Men like Kern don't face consequences. They've got money, connections. You go after him, he'll bury you in ways that make a broken pipe look kind. So I just let it go? No, Garrett said. You do exactly what you're doing. You fix your farm. You make it successful. You shove that success in their faces every single day until they choke on it. He looked at her steadily. That's the revenge that actually works. Mabel held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the house. Eli ran up to Garrett, still grinning. It's really fixed? It's really fixed. You staying? The question caught Garrett off guard. Mama needs help, Eli said. And I like having you here. You teach me stuff. Garrett looked down at the boy. This kid who'd lost his father and was trying so hard to be brave about it. I can stay a bit longer, he said carefully. Make sure everything holds through the spring thaw. Good. Eli ran off again, chasing something only he could see. Garrett stood alone in the orchard, surrounded by trees that would live now, on land that would recover. He'd done what he came to do. He should leave. But when he thought about saddling his horse and riding out of the valley, something in his chest pulled tight in a way he didn't entirely understand. Maybe it was the work. Maybe it was the boy. Maybe it was the woman in the house who'd sold her wedding ring to save her farm and refused to break no matter how many men tried to make her. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe, for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone anymore. That night, Mabel made supper for 3. They ate at the kitchen table, Garrett, Mabel, and Eli, and talked about normal things. What needed planting, when the apple buds would show, whether the old fence by the creek needed replacing. It felt almost like a family. Neither Garrett nor Mabel said that out loud, but both of them felt it. And in a barn on a failing farm in a valley full of men who wanted her to fail, something new was beginning to grow. Something that had nothing to do with irrigation lines or orchards or revenge. Something neither of them had been looking for, but something both of them desperately needed. The first storm hit 3 days after they finished the repair. Mabel woke to thunder rolling across the valley like cannon fire. Rain hammered the roof so hard she thought the shingles might tear loose. She pulled on her boots and coat in the dark, already thinking about the west field, about whether the new pipe would hold, or if Garrett had been wrong and the whole thing would collapse again. She found him already outside, standing in the downpour near the barn, watching water sheet off the roof. "You should be inside," she shouted over the rain. "Wanted to see it work," he shouted back. They stood together in the mud as lightning split the sky open. Water rushed through the ditches, filled the irrigation channels, spread across the orchard floor exactly the way it was supposed to. The northwest corner that used to flood was draining clean. The eastern section that used to stay bone dry was getting soaked. The system was working. When the storm finally broke an hour later, they were both drenched and shivering. Mabel's hair hung in ropes down her back. Garrett's coat was so waterlogged it probably weighed 20 pounds. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah." They went to the kitchen. Mabel got the stove going while Garrett peeled off his coat and hung it by the door. She made coffee strong enough to strip paint, the way Thomas used to like it, and they sat at the table without talking while warmth slowly came back to their fingers. "It held," Mabel said finally. "Told you it would." "Men have told me a lot of things." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Most of them were lies." Garrett nodded. He understood that kind of caution. "Fair enough. But you were right about this." "This time," he said. "Doesn't mean I'm right about everything." She almost smiled. That might be the most honest thing a man said to me in a year. Eli came downstairs then, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped when he saw them both soaked and muddy at the table. "Did something break?" he asked, voice tight with worry. "No," Mabel said quickly. "Everything held. We were just checking." The relief on the boy's face made Garrett's chest hurt in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. "Can I go see?" Eli asked. "After breakfast," Mabel said. "And you're wearing your good boots, not the ones with the hole." Eli groaned but didn't argue. Later that morning, the 3 of them walked the property together. The ground was soaked but draining properly. The apple trees that had been yellowing were already looking healthier, their leaves a brighter green. The grain field showed the first real signs of uniform growth Mabel had seen in 2 years. "How long before we know for sure?" Eli asked. "Month? Maybe 6 weeks," Garrett said. "Plants don't heal overnight. But if the water keeps flowing right, you'll see the difference by summer." "And then what?" the boy asked. "You leave?" Garrett glanced at Mabel. She was looking at the orchard, not at him. "Haven't decided yet," he said. That was the truth, but it felt like a lie. Because he'd been thinking about leaving every day since he arrived, planning his route north, telling himself he'd done enough. But every morning he woke up in the barn and found a reason to stay one more day. The fence that needed mending, the grain storage that wanted reorganizing, the way Eli asked questions about everything and actually listened to the answers. The way Mabel looked at him sometimes, like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just another thing that would disappoint her. By the end of April, word started spreading through town that the Carter farm was recovering. It started with the grain buyer who made his seasonal rounds. He'd planned to skip Mabel's place entirely this year, assuming she'd have nothing worth purchasing. But his route took him past the property, and he saw the fields greening up strong and even. He stopped. Mabel sold him half her projected crop right there, at a better price than she'd gotten in 3 years. The buyer mentioned it at the feed store. Someone else mentioned it at the saloon. Within a week, people were talking. "Heard the Carter place is coming back. Somebody fixed her irrigation." "Who'd she hire?" Don't know, some drifter I heard. Douglas Kern heard it from Vernon Pike, who heard it from the stable hand who'd seen Garrett ride into town that first night. Kern didn't like it. He'd been patient. He'd waited for the bank to foreclose, for Mabel to run out of money and options, for the land to die slowly enough that nobody would question his discounted offer. But if the farm recovered, if she started making money again, the whole plan fell apart. He rode out to the Carter place on a Wednesday afternoon. Mabel was working in the garden behind the house when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw Kern dismounting near the barn. A big man, well-dressed, the kind who'd never done a day's hard labor in his life but somehow owned half the valley anyway. She set down her hoe and walked to meet him. "Mr. Kern." "Mrs. Carter." He smiled the way wealthy men smiled at widows. "Heard you've had some improvements out here." Word travels. It does. He looked around the property, taking in the healthy fields, the repaired fences, the barn that no longer sagged. "Must have cost you quite a bit." "I managed." "I'm sure you did." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I also heard you've got someone staying in your barn. That true?" Mabel's jaw tightened. "I've got hired help. That a problem?" "Depends. What's his name?" "Garrett Hale. And before you ask, he's a good worker, and he's paid through the season." That was a lie. Garrett wasn't paid at all. But Kern didn't need to know that. "Just seems unusual," Kern said carefully. "A widow woman having a single man living on her property. People talk, Mrs. Carter." "People always talk." "Fair enough." Kern shifted his weight, trying a different angle. "Look, I'll be straight with you. I'm still interested in buying this land. I'll even offer you more than market value, considering the improvements you've made. You could take that money, start over somewhere easier, not have to work yourself to death every season." "I'm not interested in selling." "You sure? Because the bank's still holding that loan. One bad harvest, and you're right back where you started." Mabel met his eyes. "I'll take my chances." Kern's smile faded. "That's a mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." He stared at her for a long moment, then swung back onto his horse. "Suit yourself. But when things fall apart again, and they will, don't expect me to make the same offer twice." He rode off without waiting for a response. Mabel stood in the yard, hands shaking with anger she refused to show until he was out of sight. Garrett emerged from the barn a minute later. He'd been inside the whole time, listening. "You should have told him I'm leaving soon," he said. "Are you?" "I don't know." "Then I didn't lie." Garrett walked over to her. "He's going to cause problems." "He already has been." Mabel turned toward the house. "I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "But being right doesn't pay bills or fix broken things. Working does." She went inside before he could respond. Garrett stood in the yard looking at the land they'd brought back from the edge of ruin. He thought about men like Kern who took things they hadn't earned and broke things they didn't understand just because they could. He thought about staying, and for the first time he thought about what that would actually mean. That night, Mabel couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Kern's visit in her head, the threat barely hidden under his polite words. The way he'd looked at her land like it already belonged to him. She got out of bed and went downstairs, thinking she'd make tea, maybe read Thomas's old farming journals until exhaustion took over. But when she lit the lamp in the kitchen, she saw Garrett through the window. He was sitting outside the barn, back against the wall, staring up at the stars. She shouldn't go out there. It was past midnight. People already talked enough. She went anyway. Garrett heard her coming and stood. "Everything all right?" "Can't sleep." She sat down where he'd been sitting. After a moment, he sat beside her, leaving a careful foot of space between them. They didn't talk for a while. Finally, Mabel said, "You don't have to stay." "I know. I mean it. You fixed the irrigation. That's what you came to do. If you want to leave, I'll understand." Garrett was quiet for a long time. "What if I don't want to leave?" The question hung in the night air between them. "Why would you stay?" Mabel asked. "There's no money in it. Town already thinks you're—" She trailed off. "Thinks I'm what?" "Taking advantage of the situation." She looked at him. "Of me?" "And what do you think?" "I think you fixed my farm when nobody else would. I think you've worked harder than any man I ever paid. And I think—" She stopped, struggling with words that felt too big. I think I don't want you to go, but I can't ask you to stay. Why not? Because I've got nothing to offer you. No wages, no future, just land that's barely surviving and a son who's— Her voice cracked. Who's already lost one father. Garrett understood what she wasn't saying, that letting Eli get attached to someone who'd leave was cruel, that she was protecting her son the only way she knew how. What if I'm not leaving? He said quietly. Mabel looked at him. For how long? I don't know. Long as you'll have me, I guess. That's not a plan, Garrett. That's just— It's what I've got. He met her eyes. I've been alone for 15 years. Worked 100 farms in a dozen territories and never stayed anywhere long enough to care about it. Then I came here, and— He stopped, searching for the right words. I don't know how to explain it, but this place feels different. You feel different. Different how? Like something worth staying for. Mabel's breath caught. I'm not asking for anything, Garrett continued. I'm not trying to— This isn't about taking over or claiming something that's not mine. I just want to help. Want to be here. If you'll let me. Mabel stared at her hands. This man had appeared out of nowhere, fixed what was broken, asked for nothing, and now he was offering to stay. It should have sounded too good to be true, but nothing about Garrett felt like a lie. People will talk, she said. They already are. They'll say worse things. Let them. His voice was steady. I stopped caring what people thought a long time ago. Mabel wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this could work, that she could trust someone again, that Eli could have a man in his life who wouldn't leave. But trust was expensive, and she'd already spent everything she had. I can't make you promises, she said finally. I can't guarantee this farm will survive or that the bank won't take it, or that Kern won't find some other way to destroy everything. I can't— I'm not asking for guarantees, Garrett interrupted gently. I'm just asking if I can stay. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who meant what he said, someone who'd proven himself with actions instead of words, someone who saw her as more than a failing widow or a piece of land to acquire. All right, she whispered. You can stay. Something shifted in Garrett's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Thank you, he said. They sat together in the darkness, not touching, but closer than they'd been before. Inside the house, Eli watched from his bedroom window. He saw his mother and Garrett sitting by the barn, talking about things he couldn't hear. He saw the way Garrett looked at her, careful and steady. The way his mother's shoulders didn't look quite so tight anymore. The boy smiled and went back to bed. Maybe, he thought, things were going to be okay. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Garrett and Eli worked the fields together every morning, repairing fences and clearing irrigation channels. Mabel handled the planting and the business side, negotiating with buyers and managing the money they didn't quite have yet. Slowly, the farm came back to life. The apple trees bloomed late but heavy. The grain grew thick and green. For the first time since Thomas died, the land looked like it might actually produce something worth harvesting. But the town noticed. Mabel felt it every time she went in for supplies. The way conversation stopped when she walked into the general store. The pointed looks from women who used to be her friends. The comments made just loud enough for her to hear. Shameful, if you ask me. That man living right there on her property. Poor Thomas barely cold in the ground. She ignored it, the way she ignored most things that didn't involve keeping her farm alive. But Garrett felt it too. Men at the feed store stopped talking when he came in. The stable hand wouldn't meet his eyes. The shopkeeper who sold him nails made a comment about temporary workers knowing their place. Garrett had dealt with worse, but it bothered him that the gossip was hurting Mabel's reputation. One evening, he brought it up. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching Eli chase fireflies in the yard. The air was warm, almost summer now, and everything smelled like growing things. Maybe I should take a room in town, Garrett said. Mabel looked at him. Why? People talk. About me staying in the barn. Might be easier if— No. Mabel. No, she repeated harder. I'm not changing how I run my farm because small-minded people can't control their tongues. You stay where you are. Garrett studied her face. It doesn't bother you, what they say. It bothers me, she admitted, but not enough to care more about their opinions than my own survival. She looked at him. You're good for this place. For Eli. For... She stopped. For you? He finished quietly. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade. Then Eli ran up, cupping something in his hands. Look! I caught one! The firefly pulsed yellow-green between his fingers. Good job, Garrett said. Now let it go. Why? Because things that glow like that? They're better off free. Eli opened his hands and the firefly lifted away, blinking into the dusk. Can we do this every night? The boy asked. If you want, Mabel said. Eli grinned and ran off again. Garrett watched him go. He's a good kid. He is. Mabel's voice was soft. He asks about you, you know, when you're going to leave. What do you tell him? That I don't know. She paused. He's getting attached. Yeah. That scares me. Garrett nodded. Scares me too. But you're staying anyway? I said I would. Mabel looked at him, this quiet man who'd kept every promise he'd made, who worked harder than anyone she'd ever hired, who treated her son like he mattered. Garrett, she said slowly, what are we doing here? He knew what she meant. This wasn't just about irrigation lines and crop yields anymore. Something else was growing between them, something neither of them had planned for or knew how to name. I don't know, he admitted, but whatever it is, I'm not running from it. Even if it's complicated? Especially if it's complicated. Mabel's hands tightened on the porch railing. She wanted to say something more, wanted to ask the question she was too afraid to voice, but Eli came running back, and the moment passed. Later that night, alone in her room, Mabel stared at the ceiling and thought about trust. Thomas had been easy to trust. They'd grown up together, married young, built the farm side by side. She'd never questioned whether he'd stay or whether he loved her. Then he died, and she learned that trust wasn't enough, that love couldn't stop hearts from failing or land from breaking or men from lying about irrigation systems they knew how to fix. But Garrett was different. He'd earned her trust through mud and rain and work. He'd proven himself with actions, not words. And when she looked at him, she didn't see someone trying to take something from her. She saw someone offering to build something with her. The difference terrified her, because if she let herself believe in this, in him, and it fell apart, she didn't think she'd survive it. But if she didn't take the chance, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. She fell asleep without deciding anything. In the barn, Garrett lay awake thinking similar thoughts. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. No roots, no commitments, no staying long enough to care. It was safer that way, cleaner. But Mabel Carter and her failing farm and her grieving son had broken through every defense he'd built. He cared, and that meant he was vulnerable in ways he hadn't been since he was young, and stupid enough to think caring didn't cost anything. But he couldn't leave now. Even if Kern came after them, even if the town turned hostile, even if staying meant facing things he'd spent years running from. He'd made a promise, and for the first time in a long time, keeping that promise mattered more than protecting himself. The first major test came in June. A summer storm rolled through the valley with winds strong enough to snap branches off the oldest apple trees. Mabel, Garrett, and Eli spent hours securing equipment and covering what they could. When the storm hit, it hit hard. Rain came down in sheets. Wind tore at the barn roof. Lightning struck so close the ground shook. They huddled in the kitchen, listening to the farm get battered. The orchard, Mabel said, staring out the window into darkness. If we lose the trees... We won't, Garrett said, though he had no way of knowing that. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it finally passed, they went outside with lanterns to assess the damage. Branches everywhere. Part of the barn roof torn loose. The fence by the creek knocked flat. But the orchard was standing. And when Garrett checked the irrigation system, water was flowing exactly the way it should. The west field, the one that used to flood every time it rained, was draining perfectly. It worked, Mabel whispered. It actually worked. Garrett felt something loosen in his chest. Told you it would. They spent the next 3 days cleaning up storm damage. Neighbors came to help, people Mabel hadn't seen in months. They'd heard about the recovery, seen the fields greening up, and suddenly the widow with the cursed farm was worth helping again. Mabel accepted their help, but didn't forget that they'd stayed away when she needed them most. One of the men who came was Amos Reed, the elderly shopkeeper. He worked slowly, his hands arthritic, but he insisted on helping clear branches from the orchard. On the second day, he pulled Mabel aside. "Need to tell you something," he said quietly. "What?" Amos glanced around, making sure nobody else was listening. "About your irrigation system, about why it stayed broken so long." Mabel went very still. "I'm listening." "Vernon Pike knew," Amos said. "From the first time he inspected your land. He knew exactly what was wrong." "How do you know that?" "Because I heard him and Kern talking about it, at the saloon after Thomas died." Amos looked ashamed. "They planned it. Kern wanted your land, and Vernon agreed to make sure nobody fixed the problem. Every inspector who came out here was either paid off or fed bad information." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach turn. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I should have told you a year ago." Amos met her eyes. "I was a coward. Kern's powerful, and I didn't want trouble. But watching you fight this hard, watching you nearly lose everything, I can't stay quiet anymore. You deserve to know what they did." Mabel's hands were shaking. "Can you prove it?" "Not in a way that would hold up in court, but I'll swear to what I heard, if it comes to that." "Thank you," Mabel said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. After Amos left, she told Garrett everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each detail. "We should confront them," Mabel said. "Make them admit what they did." "That won't work." "Why not?" "Because men like Kern don't admit anything unless you've got evidence they can't deny. Right now it's your word against his." Garrett paused. "But there might be another way." "What way?" "You make this farm so successful that Kern's plan fails completely. Show everyone that you can't be broken. That's the kind of revenge that actually sticks." Mabel wanted immediate justice. She wanted Kern to face consequences. She wanted everyone in town to know what he'd done. But Garrett was right. The best revenge was survival. "All right," she said. "Then let's make sure we survive." They worked harder than ever after that. By July, the orchard was heavy with fruit. The grain fields were the healthiest they'd been in 5 years. Buyers came from 3 counties to make offers on the harvest. Mabel sold the crop for more money than she'd seen since Thomas was alive. She paid off the bank loan in full. When she walked out of the bank with the paid receipt in her hand, she saw Douglas Kern across the street, watching her. She met his eyes and smiled. Then she turned and walked away, victorious. That night, she, Garrett, and Eli celebrated with a proper meal: roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie made from their own fruit. "To the farm," Mabel said, raising her glass of water. "To the farm," Garrett and Eli echoed. They ate and laughed, and for the first time in longer than Mabel could remember, everything felt right. After Eli went to bed, Mabel and Garrett sat on the porch in the warm summer darkness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For staying. For believing me when nobody else did. For—" She stopped, searching for words. "For all of it." Garrett looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. The careful distance he usually kept had slipped. "Mabel," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to—" He stopped, frustrated with himself. "I came here to fix a pipe and leave. That's all. But somewhere along the way, this place became— you became—" He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Mabel's heart was pounding. "Became what?" she whispered. Garrett stood, crossed the porch, and held out his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet, and suddenly they were standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could see the vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept hidden. "Became everything," he finished. Mabel couldn't breathe. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Thomas was the only— I don't know how to start over." "Neither do I," Garrett said. "But I want to try, if you do." She looked up at him. This man who'd saved her farm and taught her son and stood beside her through storms and gossip and betrayal without asking for anything in return. And she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. "Yes," she said, "I want to try." Garrett smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she'd known him. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was careful and tentative and nothing like the romance novels Mabel used to read. But it was real, and it was theirs, and when they finally pulled apart, she was crying. "You all right?" Garrett asked softly. "Yeah," she managed. "I'm all right." They stood together on the porch, holding hands in the darkness, while fireflies blinked across the orchard and the farm they'd saved together breathed quietly around them. Inside the house, Eli peeked through his window and saw them. He grinned, punched the air in silent victory, and went back to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Kern wasn't going to give up. The town would keep talking. The farm would need constant work. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, 3 people who'd been broken in different ways had found something worth holding on to. And that was enough. The morning after the kiss, Mabel woke up terrified. She'd let herself want something again, let herself believe in the possibility of happiness beyond just survival. And every time she'd done that before, life had taken it away. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Garrett move around in the barn below, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But when she went downstairs and saw Eli already dressed and waiting for breakfast, grinning like he knew a secret, she realized there was no going back. Whatever was happening between her and Garrett, it was already affecting more than just the 2 of them. "Morning, Mama," Eli said, too cheerful for this early. "Morning." She started the coffee. "You're up early." "Garrett said we're fixing the fence by the creek today, the one the storm knocked down." "Did he?" Eli nodded, still grinning. "He's a good teacher. Shows me how to do stuff instead of just doing it himself." Mabel's hands paused over the coffee pot. "You like having him here, don't you?" "Yeah." The boy's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious. "Is he staying? For real this time?" The question hung in the kitchen air. Mabel wanted to give her son certainty, wanted to promise that Garrett wasn't going anywhere. But she'd learned the hard way that promises about the future were just pretty lies waiting to break. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope so." "Me too," Eli said quietly. Garrett came in a few minutes later, stamping mud off his boots at the door. He caught Mabel's eye, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement of what had happened, uncertainty about what came next, and underneath it all, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Morning," he said. "Morning." They had breakfast together like they had every morning for weeks now, but everything felt different. The air was charged with things unsaid. Eli kept glancing between them like he was waiting for an announcement. Finally, Mabel couldn't take it anymore. "Eli, go get the fence tools from the barn," she said. "Garrett and I will meet you at the creek in 10 minutes. The boy ran off, and suddenly she and Garrett were alone. "About last night," Garrett started. "Don't," Mabel interrupted. "Don't apologize or take it back, or—" "I wasn't going to." He stepped closer. "I was going to ask if you regretted it." She looked at him. "Do you?" "No." "Then neither do I." She paused. "But I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of this not working. Of Eli getting hurt. Of—" She stopped, struggling with words that felt too big. "Of caring about you and then losing you anyway." Garrett reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused from work, warm and solid. "I can't promise I'll never leave," he said quietly. "Can't promise I won't mess this up, or that everything will work out perfect. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere today, or tomorrow, or the day after that. That's not much of a promise. It's the only kind I know how to keep." Mabel squeezed his hand once, then let go. "All right, then let's take it one day at a time." "One day at a time," he agreed. They worked the fence line together that morning, the 3 of them. Eli asked questions about why posts had to be set at certain depths, why cross-bracing mattered, why you couldn't just nail boards together and call it done. Garrett answered every question with patience, showing the boy how to measure angles and test stability. Mabel watched them work and felt something shift in her chest. Eli hadn't smiled this much since Thomas died. And Garrett, quiet, guarded Garrett, looked almost relaxed when he was teaching. They were good together. The thought scared her as much as it comforted her. By mid-August, the gossip in town had reached a fever pitch. The widow Carter and her hired man were living in sin, people said. Shameful, carrying on like that with a child in the house. Poor Thomas barely cold in the ground, and she'd already moved on. Mabel heard it every time she went to town. She saw it in the way women crossed the street to avoid her, in the tight smiles of the shopkeeper's wife, in the pointed stares from men who thought they had a right to judge her choices. She ignored most of it, but when the pastor's wife made a comment about proper Christian behavior while Mabel was buying flour, something inside her snapped. "Mrs. Henderson," Mabel said, her voice cold and clear. "My farm was dying. My son was going hungry, and not one person in this town offered to help. Not you, not your husband, not anyone. So forgive me if I don't particularly care what you think about how I run my life." She paid for her flour and left, leaving Mrs. Henderson sputtering behind her. Word of the confrontation spread faster than the original gossip. Some people were scandalized. Others privately admitted that Mabel had a point. A few even started to question why they'd been so quick to condemn a woman who was just trying to survive. But Douglas Kearns saw an opportunity. He started visiting people in town, making concerned noises about the widow Carter's reputation, suggesting that maybe someone should check on the boy, make sure he was being raised in a proper environment, hinting that perhaps the farm should be investigated for code violations, safety issues, anything that might force Mabel to sell. Vernon Pike backed him up, of course. So did Hugh Strauss and a few other ranchers who'd always resented the Carter family's success. The pressure started building slowly. The bank manager mentioned that he'd received concerns about the property. The town sheriff rode out to the farm one afternoon, ostensibly to check that everything was all right, but really to let Mabel know she was being watched. "People are talking, Mrs. Carter," the sheriff said, standing in her yard and looking uncomfortable. "People always talk," Mabel replied. "True enough, but when enough people talk, sometimes I have to listen." He glanced toward the barn where Garrett was working. "That man causing any trouble?" "No, he's good help." "He living here?" "He's staying in the barn, working for room and board." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Just wanted to make sure everything was proper." After he left, Mabel told Garrett what had happened. "They're trying to run you out," he said quietly. "Make life difficult enough that you sell just to escape the pressure." "I know. What do you want to do?" Mabel looked at her farm, the healthy orchard, the productive grain fields, the land she and Garrett had brought back from the edge of death. Then she looked at the barn where Garrett lived, at the careful distance they maintained in public to avoid more gossip. "I'm tired of hiding," she said, "tired of caring what they think." "Meaning?" She met his eyes. "Meaning maybe it's time we gave them something real to talk about." Garrett understood what she was suggesting. "You sure?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." That night she asked him to move into the house. Not into her room, that would come later if it came at all, but into the spare room upstairs, the one that had been storage since Thomas died. The message would be clear. Garrett Hale wasn't just hired help anymore. He was part of the household, part of the family. Garrett looked at her for a long time before answering. "That's going to make things worse in town," he said. "A lot worse." "I know. Eli's going to catch hell for it at school when fall comes." "I know that too. And Kern's going to use it against you. Call your character into question. Maybe try to get the law involved." "Let him try." Mabel's voice was steady. "I'm done living my life according to what other people think is proper. This is my land, my home. And you—" She stopped, then pushed forward. "You've earned a place here, if you want it." Garrett stood there in the fading evening light, this drifter who'd never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home, and realized he was being offered something he'd given up hoping for years ago. A place to belong. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll move my things tomorrow." "Not tomorrow." Mabel's jaw was set. "Tonight. I want everyone in this valley to know by morning that I made my choice." So they did it that night. Garrett carried his few belongings from the barn to the house while Eli watched, wide-eyed and hopeful. They set up the spare room with a bed and dresser, hung his coat by the door next to Mabel's and Eli's. Small things. But they meant everything. When they were done, the three of them stood in the kitchen and looked at each other. "So," Eli said, barely containing his excitement, "does this mean Garrett's staying forever?" "It means he's staying for now," Mabel said carefully. "That's all any of us can promise." But the way she looked at Garrett when she said it made it clear she was hoping for more than just for now. The news hit town by noon the next day. The stable hand saw Garrett's horse still in the Carter barn, but Garrett himself coming out of the house that morning. The shopkeeper's daughter saw them all having breakfast together through the kitchen window when she delivered eggs. By lunch, everyone knew. The widow Carter had moved her hired man into the house. The reactions were predictable. Some people were scandalized. Others were sympathetic. A few admitted privately that Mabel Carter was a grown woman who could make her own choices. But Douglas Kern was furious. He called a meeting at his ranch that evening with Vernon Pike, Hugh Strauss, and 2 other ranchers who'd been part of the plan to acquire the Carter land. "She's making fools of us," Kern said, pacing his study. "That farm should be mine by now. Should have failed months ago." "The drifter fixed the irrigation," Vernon said. "Nothing we can do about that now. There's plenty we can do." Kern stopped pacing. "We make this about morality, about protecting the community, about making sure that boy isn't being raised in a sinful environment." "How?" Hugh asked. "We go to the pastor, get him to speak out against it. Then we go to the school board, make sure they know what kind of household young Eli Carter is living in. Put enough pressure on her from enough directions, she'll crack." "And if she doesn't?" Vernon asked. Kern's expression went cold. "Then we find another way to make her life difficult. There's always another way." But what Kern didn't know was that Amos Reed was standing outside the study window, listening to every word. The old shopkeeper had suspected Kern was up to something when he saw the meeting being assembled. And now, hearing the plan laid out so coldly, he knew he had to warn Mabel. He rode to the Carter farm that night, after dark, and told her everything. Mabel listened in silence, her hands clenched into fists. "They're going after Eli now," she said when Amos finished. "Going after my son." "That's the plan," Amos confirmed. "Make life hard enough that you give up." Garrett had been standing in the corner, listening. Now he stepped forward. "Let me talk to Kern," he said. "No," Mabel said immediately. "Why not?" "Because men like him don't respond to talking. They respond to power, and we don't have any." "We have this farm," Garrett said. "We have success. That's power. It's not enough." "Then what is?" Mabel looked at Amos. "Can you get me proof? Something that shows Kern and Vernon plan to sabotage my irrigation?" "I can testify to what I heard," Amos said, "but testimony isn't the same as evidence." "Then we'll have to create evidence," Mabel said grimly. "How?" Garrett asked. She thought for a moment, her mind working through possibilities. Then an idea came to her. Risky, maybe illegal, but possibly their only chance. "We set a trap," she said slowly. "Make Kern think he can still win. Get him to admit what he did where someone can hear it." "That's dangerous," Garrett said. "Everything about this is dangerous." Mabel looked at him. "But I'm not letting them take my son's future because they think I'm weak. Not anymore." They spent the next 2 hours planning. The trap was simple but required perfect timing. Mabel would approach Kern privately, tell him she was considering selling after all. The pressure from town was too much, she'd say. She wanted out, but she'd demand a premium price, higher than the land was worth. Kern's greed would make him negotiate, and during that negotiation, Mabel would push him to admit why he wanted the land so badly, why he'd been so certain it would fail. Amos would be hidden nearby, listening. If Kern incriminated himself, they'd have a witness. It wasn't much, but it was something. 3 days later, Mabel rode into town and asked to meet with Douglas Kern. He received her in his study, trying to hide his satisfaction behind a mask of concern. "Mrs. Carter," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I'm glad you came. I've been worried about you." "I'm sure you have." Mabel sat down, playing her role. "I need to talk to you about your offer, the one to buy my land." Kern's eyes lit up. "You're interested in selling?" "Maybe. Depends on the terms." "Well, I'm prepared to be generous. Given the improvements you've made, I could offer—" "Double," Mabel interrupted. "I want double what you offered last year." Kern blinked. "That's quite a bit more than market value. You said yourself the land's improved, and you've wanted it for a long time." She met his eyes. "Why is that, Mr. Kern? Why are you so determined to own my property specifically?" "It's good land," Kern said carefully. "Borders my holdings. Makes sense to expand." "But it wasn't good land a year ago," Mabel pressed. "You and everyone else said it was failing. Cursed, even. Yet you still wanted to buy it. Why? Kern shifted in his chair. Every piece of land has potential. Even land with broken irrigation that 3 experts said couldn't be fixed? Something flickered in Kern's expression. Wariness, maybe suspicion. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Carter. I'm not implying anything. I'm just trying to understand why you were so confident you could succeed where I was failing. She leaned forward slightly. It's almost like you knew something I didn't. Kern's jaw tightened. If you're accusing me of something, I'm not accusing anyone. Just wondering how Vernon Pike could inspect my irrigation and miss a 25-foot collapse that was choking my entire system. Seems like an odd mistake for an experienced engineer to make. The silence that followed was heavy. Kern stood up. I think this meeting is over. So you're not interested in buying anymore? Not at that price. And frankly, Mrs. Carter, I'm starting to think you came here to waste my time. Mabel stood slowly. Maybe I did. Or maybe I came here to see if you'd admit what you did. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Mabel's voice was cold now. You wanted my land. You paid Vernon to lie about the irrigation. You waited for me to fail so you could buy it cheap. And when that didn't work, you tried to destroy my reputation instead. Kern's face flushed red. That's slander. It's the truth. You can't prove any of it. Can't I? Mabel bluffed. I've got witnesses, I've got testimony, and I've got a whole town starting to ask questions about why you were so sure my farm would fail. Kern took a step toward her, anger breaking through his careful control. You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Carter. You have no idea how dangerous. Is that a threat? It's advice. Walk away, sell me the land at a fair price, and get out of this valley before… He stopped himself. Before what? Mabel pushed. Before you find another way to force me out? Before you ruin me completely? Kern's eyes narrowed. You should have sold when you had the chance, while people still thought you were just an unlucky widow instead of a… Instead of a what? Mabel demanded. A woman who won't let you steal from her? A woman who fights back? Instead of a whore living with a drifter and raising her son in sin, Kern spat. That's what people think now. That's what they'll always think, and no amount of success will change it. The words hit like a slap, but Mabel didn't flinch. At least I'm honest about what I am, she said quietly. Can you say the same? Kern stared at her, breathing hard. For a moment she thought he might confess, might let his anger push him into admitting everything. But then his expression closed off, cold and controlled again. Get out of my house, he said. Mabel left. Outside, hidden in the shadow of Kern's barn, Amos Reed had heard every word. It wasn't a full confession, but it was close. Close enough to start asking the right questions in the right places. That evening, Amos went to the pastor and told him what he'd heard. Then he went to the school board chairman. Then to the bank manager. He didn't accuse Kern directly. He just asked questions. Made people wonder. Planted seeds of doubt about whether the widow Carter was really the problem everyone had assumed she was. The gossip in town started to shift. Not completely, not overnight, but enough that people began to question the narrative they'd been told. Maybe Mabel Carter wasn't a sinful woman destroying her late husband's legacy. Maybe she was just a survivor doing what she had to do. Maybe Douglas Kern's concern for her reputation wasn't as pure as he claimed. Maybe there was more to the story than anyone had bothered to ask. The shift was subtle, but Mabel felt it when she went to town the next week. Fewer pointed stares, a few sympathetic nods. The shopkeeper's wife, who'd lectured her about Christian behavior, actually apologized. I shouldn't have judged, the woman said quietly. It's not my place. Mabel nodded acceptance, but didn't forget how quick those same people had been to condemn her. Garrett noticed the change too. Town seems different, he said one evening. Amos has been talking, Mabel explained, making people question Kern's version of things. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it's a start. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the orchard. Eli was inside, already asleep. It was just the two of them in the warm evening air. Mabel, Garrett said quietly, I need to tell you something. She looked at him, heart suddenly pounding. What? I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Mabel's breath caught. She'd known, on some level, that what was growing between them was more than just partnership or convenience, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that terrified her. "You don't have to say it back," Garrett continued. "I just needed you to know. Whatever happens with Kern, with the town, with any of it, I love you, and I'm not leaving." Mabel stared at him, this quiet man who'd appeared in her life when she needed him most, who'd worked beside her through mud and storms and gossip without asking for anything in return. She thought about Thomas, about the life she'd built and lost, about the fear that had lived in her chest since he died, the certainty that trusting anyone again would only lead to more pain. But she also thought about the past few months, about mornings working the fields together, about Eli's laughter, about the way Garrett looked at her like she was strong instead of broken, about the fact that she'd been happier in the last 3 months than she'd been in the last 3 years. "I love you too," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. Garrett smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Then he pulled a small object from his pocket and held it out to her. It was a ring, not expensive, not fancy, just a simple iron band that looked like it had been carefully polished. "It's not much," he said, "but I made it myself, from one of the old pipe fittings we replaced in the irrigation line." Mabel took the ring, turning it over in her hands. It was rough around the edges, not perfectly circular, clearly handmade. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Garrett," she whispered. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the gossip or because it would make things easier. Marry me because I want to build a life with you, want to be Eli's father, want to wake up on this farm every morning and know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Tears were streaming down Mabel's face now. She thought she'd never want this again, never trust anyone enough to make that kind of promise. But here was Garrett, offering her not perfection, but partnership. Not a rescue, but a partnership. Not promises about forever, but a commitment to try. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for her hand, which, she realized, it had been. They kissed there on the porch, under the stars, while the farm they'd saved together breathed quietly around them. And for the first time since Thomas died, Mabel believed that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy again. Inside the house, Eli had been listening through his bedroom window. When he heard his mother say yes, he let out a whoop of joy loud enough to wake the chickens. Mabel and Garrett broke apart, laughing, as Eli came racing down the stairs and out onto the porch. "You're getting married?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "Yes," Mabel confirmed. "Does that mean Garrett's staying forever?" Garrett crouched down to the boy's level. "Means I'm staying as long as your mama and you will have me." Eli threw his arms around Garrett's neck. "That's forever then." Garrett hugged him back, meeting Mabel's eyes over the boy's shoulder. They both knew it wasn't going to be easy. Kern wouldn't give up. The town would talk. There would be hard days ahead. But right now, in this moment, they were a family. And that was worth fighting for. The morning after the engagement, Mabel woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Eli's voice drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment she lay still, the iron ring on her finger catching the early light, and let herself feel what she'd been too afraid to feel for so long. Safe. Not perfectly safe. Not completely protected from everything that could go wrong, but safe enough to breathe without her chest feeling tight. Safe enough to imagine a future that didn't end in loss. She went downstairs to find Garrett and Eli already at the table, arguing good-naturedly about whether pancakes needed butter and syrup or just syrup. "Both," Mabel said, settling the debate. "You need both." Eli grinned at her, then noticed the ring. His eyes went wide. "You're still wearing it." "Why wouldn't I be?" "I thought maybe I dreamed it," the boy admitted. Garrett met Mabel's eyes across the table. Not a dream. They ate breakfast together, making plans. The wedding would be simple, they decided. Just the three of them, and whoever wanted to witness it. No big ceremony, no expensive celebration, just vows and signatures and the quiet acknowledgement that what they'd built together was worth making official. "When?" Eli asked. "Soon," Mabel said. "No point waiting." "Next month," Garrett suggested. "After harvest. Give us time to finish the season strong." Mabel nodded. One more month of being engaged. One more month before the whole valley knew for certain that she'd chosen this life, this man, this future. One more month for Douglas Kern to try to stop it. The thought came unbidden, and she pushed it away. But it lingered there, a shadow at the edge of her happiness. Kern heard about the engagement within 3 days, Vernon Pike told him, having heard it from the stable hand who'd seen the ring on Mabel's finger when she came to town for supplies. Kern's reaction was predictable. He threw a glass across his study hard enough to shatter it against the wall. "She's mocking us," he said to Vernon and Hugh Strauss, who'd been summoned to the ranch, "making a spectacle of herself in that drifter, rubbing our faces in it." "What do you want to do?" Hugh asked carefully. Kern paced the room, thinking. "We go harder. Make it clear that this marriage won't be tolerated. Talk to the pastor, get him to refuse to perform the ceremony. Talk to the town council about code violations. Find any legal reason to make her life difficult." "And if that doesn't work?" Vernon asked. Kern's expression went cold. "Then we make it personal. There are ways to break a farm that have nothing to do with irrigation." Hugh shifted uncomfortably. "You talking about sabotage?" "I'm talking about doing whatever it takes to get what should have been mine a year ago." But Hugh was starting to have doubts. He'd gone along with the irrigation scheme because it seemed harmless enough, just letting nature take its course, as Kern had put it. But this was different. This was active destruction. "I don't know, Douglas," he said slowly. "People are already asking questions. If something happens to her farm now, right after she crossed you, this spoggy, then we make sure it doesn't look like us," Kern interrupted. "An accident. Bad luck. The kind of thing that happens on struggling farms." Vernon was nodding, but Hugh still looked uncertain. That uncertainty would matter later, though nobody knew it yet. Meanwhile, Mabel and Garrett were dealing with their own problems. The pastor, Reverend Matthews, came to the farm one afternoon. He was a thin man in his 60s, well-meaning but easily influenced by the wealthier members of his congregation. "Mrs. Carter," he said, standing awkwardly in her kitchen, "I heard about your engagement." "News travels fast," Mabel said neutrally. "I wanted to speak with you about it. There are concerns." "What kind of concerns?" The Reverend cleared his throat. "About the propriety of the situation. You and Mr. Hale living under the same roof before marriage. It's irregular." "We have separate rooms," Mabel said, though it wasn't really anyone's business. "Still, it gives the appearance of impropriety, and there's been talk about whether it's appropriate for me to perform the ceremony given the circumstances." Mabel's hands tightened on the dish towel she'd been holding. "Circumstances meaning what?" "Meaning the speed of the relationship. The fact that Mr. Hale is—" He paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Not from here. Not known to the community." "He's known to me," Mabel said quietly. "He's known to my son. That's what matters." "I understand, but—" "Reverend Matthews," Mabel interrupted, "let me make this simple. Are you willing to marry us or not?" The Reverend looked pained. "I need time to pray on it, to consider what's best for everyone involved." "Take all the time you need," Mabel said. "But understand that with or without you, this wedding is happening." After he left, Garrett came in from the barn, where he'd been deliberately making himself scarce during the conversation. "He's not going to do it," he said. "No," Mabel agreed. "He's not." "Does it matter? We can get married at the courthouse. Don't need a church wedding." "I know." Mabel sat down heavily. "But it would have been nice, for Eli, if nothing else. He deserves something that feels official." Garrett pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "We'll make it official, just might look different than you planned." "Everything about this looks different than I planned," Mabel said, but she was smiling slightly. "Thomas and I got married in that church. Big ceremony, everyone we knew. I wore my mother's dress. It was perfect. You want that again?" "No." She looked at the ring on her finger. "I want something real. And this is real, even if it's not what people expect." "Then that's what we'll do." But before they could make any firm plans, trouble found them. It started with the grain. Mabel went out to check the east field one morning and found something wrong. The stalks that had been golden and healthy just days before were wilting. Not all of them, just patches, scattered across the field in no obvious pattern. She called Garrett over. He examined the affected plants, pulling up samples to check the roots. His expression darkened as he worked. "What is it?" Mabel asked. "Blight, maybe, or something else." He dug deeper, checking the soil. But it doesn't make sense. This field's been healthy all season. Blight doesn't just appear overnight in random patches. Could it be the irrigation? Something we missed? No. Water's flowing fine. He stood, wiping dirt from his hands. This looks intentional. The word hung between them. You think someone sabotaged the field? Mabel asked. I think someone put something in the soil, something to kill the crop without making it obvious. Mabel's stomach turned. Kern. Can't prove it, Garrett said. But timing's suspicious. They spent the rest of the day trying to salvage what they could, digging up affected plants, treating the soil. But the damage was done. They'd lose maybe 20% of the grain harvest. Not enough to ruin them, but enough to hurt. Enough to send a message. That night, Mabel barely slept. She kept thinking about Kern, about how far he was willing to go, about what he might try next. But when morning came, she got up and went back to work. Because that's what you did on a farm. You dealt with the problem in front of you and kept moving. The next incident came a week later. Someone cut the fence on the north pasture during the night. The section Garrett and Eli had repaired after the storm, carefully rebuilt with proper bracing and solid posts. Someone had gone through with wire cutters and destroyed it. 3 of their best sheep got out. They found 2 of them by noon, the third they never found. Eli cried when he realized she was gone. She'd been his favorite, a ewe he'd bottle-fed as a lamb. Garrett put his hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm sorry, son. Why would someone do this? Eli asked, voice breaking. Mabel and Garrett exchanged looks over his head. They both knew why. But explaining adult cruelty to a 9-year-old wasn't something Mabel was ready to do. Some people are mean, she said instead, for no good reason. Was it Mr. Kern? The question startled her. Why would you think that? I heard you and Garrett talking about how he wanted our farm and tried to make it fail. Eli wiped his eyes. Is he doing this? Mabel crouched down to her son's level. We don't know for sure, and without proof, we can't accuse anyone. But you think it's him? She didn't want to lie. Yeah, I think it's him. Then why don't we do something? Like what? I don't know. Tell the sheriff. Make him stop. It's not that simple, Garrett said gently. Men like Kern, they're careful. They don't do their own dirty work, and they don't leave evidence. That's not fair. No, Mabel agreed. It's not. But life wasn't fair, and the sooner Eli learned that, the better prepared he'd be for the world. It was a harsh lesson, and Mabel hated teaching it, but someone had to. They repaired the fence again. Garrett added extra reinforcement this time, and Mabel started checking the property every night before bed, walking the fence line with a lantern, looking for signs of tampering. It became a routine. Work all day, check the fences at night, sleep with one ear listening for trouble. The stress started to wear on all of them. Eli got quieter, more watchful. Mabel's patience grew shorter. Even Garrett, usually so calm, snapped at a stuck gate one afternoon and kicked it hard enough to hurt his foot. They were being ground down, and they all knew it. 3 weeks before the planned wedding, Mabel got a letter from the bank. The loan was paid off, but the bank manager wanted to discuss investment opportunities and property development options. Translation? Someone was still trying to buy her land, and the bank was willing to facilitate. She threw the letter in the fire. That same week, the school board sent a notice that they'd be evaluating the home environment before allowing Eli to enroll for the fall term, making sure he was being raised in an appropriate setting. Mabel knew exactly who was behind that too. They're trying to take him, she said to Garrett that night, using morality as an excuse, but they're trying to take my son. They won't succeed, Garrett said. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He pulled her close. Because you're a good mother, this is a good home, and any honest person who looks at Eli can see he's happy and healthy and loved. They've got nothing real to stand on. Since when has that mattered? Mabel's voice was bitter. Since when do men like Kern need real reasons to get what they want? Garrett didn't have an answer for that. But the next day, something shifted. Hugh Strauss showed up at the farm, alone, looking nervous. Mabel met him at the property line, not inviting him closer. What do you want? To talk, Hugh said. Just talk. Please. Garrett appeared from the barn, positioning himself between Hugh and Mabel. Talk fast. Hugh glanced between them, then seemed to make a decision. I'm out. Whatever Kern's planning next, I want no part of it. Why should we believe you? Mabel asked. Because I'm risking my neck just being here. Kern finds out I talked to you, Hugh stopped. Look, I went along with the irrigation thing because I thought it was just business. Letting nature take its course, Kern said, but this has gone too far. Sabotaging crops, cutting fences, trying to take your son. That's not business. That's cruelty. You're just figuring that out now? Mabel's voice was cold. I know, I'm a coward. I should have said something sooner. Hugh met her eyes. But I'm saying it now. Kern's planning something big. Something that'll force you out for good. What? Garrett demanded. I don't know exactly. He stopped telling me the details after I started asking too many questions. But it's happening soon. Before your wedding. Mabel felt ice in her stomach. What kind of something? The kind that makes it look like an accident, Hugh said quietly. That's all I know. But I couldn't just stand by and let it happen without warning you. Why? Mabel asked. Why tell us now? Hugh looked at the farm, the healthy orchard, the repaired buildings, the land that was clearly thriving despite everything thrown at it. Because you don't deserve this. You worked hard, you earned your success, and watching Kern try to destroy you for it makes me sick. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Carter, but I'm not evil enough to be part of whatever he's planning next. There was a long silence. Finally, Garrett said, What do you expect us to do with this information? I don't know. Be careful. Watch your back. Maybe, Hugh hesitated. Maybe get out for a few days. Take your boys somewhere safe until whatever Kern's planning blows over. I'm not leaving my land, Mabel said immediately. Then at least be ready for trouble. Hugh left without another word. Mabel and Garrett stood in the yard watching him ride away. You believe him? Garrett asked. I don't know. Maybe. Mabel's hands were shaking. But I'm not running. This is my home. If Kern wants it, he'll have to take it from me by force. That might be exactly what he's planning, Garrett said quietly. Then we'll be ready. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Garrett reinforced the barn doors and added locks. They moved the most valuable tools and equipment into the house. Mabel taught Eli how to get out of the house quickly if there was ever a fire, showing him the window routes and where to run. The boy didn't ask why they were suddenly so concerned with safety. He was smart enough to understand that something bad was coming. They took turns sleeping, one of them always awake and watching. The attack came on a moonless night, 4 days before the wedding. Mabel woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and down the stairs before she was fully conscious, her mind screaming, fire, fire, fire. Garrett was already outside, and through the window she could see orange light flickering from the direction of the barn. Someone had set it on fire. She ran outside, grabbing buckets, screaming for Eli to stay in the house. But the boy was already there, hauling water from the pump with tears streaming down his face. The barn was fully engulfed. The flames had caught too fast, spread too quick. This wasn't an accident. This was arson, planned and executed while they slept. Neighbors appeared, drawn by the light. Some helped with water. Others just watched. A few looked satisfied, and Mabel knew they were Kern's people, here to witness her destruction. They fought the fire for 3 hours. By the time they got it under control, the barn was gone. Just a skeleton of charred beams and smoking ash. Every tool they'd stored there, every bit of feed and hay, Garrett's few personal possessions, all of it destroyed. They'd saved the house, barely. The orchard was untouched, but the barn was a total loss. Mabel stood in the yard as dawn broke, covered in soot and ash, staring at the ruins. Garrett came up beside her, equally filthy. Everyone okay? Eli's fine. Shaken, but fine. Good. They stood together in silence. Then Mabel said very quietly, I'm going to kill him. No, you're not. Garrett, cheap. No. He turned to face her. You're not going to kill him, and you're not going to do anything stupid that gets you arrested or worse. You know why? Because that's what he wants. He wants you to break, to lash out, to give him a reason to have you dragged away in chains. So what do we do? Mabel's voice cracked. Just let him win? We rebuild. Garrett's jaw was set. We rebuild the barn, we keep working the farm, and we get married in 4 days exactly like we planned. That's how we win. We can't rebuild a barn in 4 days. Then we rebuild it in 4 weeks, 4 months, however long it takes. He gripped her shoulders. Mabel, listen to me. The barn is wood. Wood can be replaced. You, Eli, this land, that's what matters. That's what we protect. Tears were streaming down Mabel's face now, cutting tracks through the soot. I'm so tired of fighting, she whispered. I know. I don't know if I can keep doing this. You can. Garrett pulled her close. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and you're not doing it alone anymore. Mabel buried her face against his chest and cried for the first time since Thomas died. Really cried, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. All the fear and anger and exhaustion she'd been holding in for months came pouring out. Garrett held her through it, not trying to fix anything, just being there. When she finally pulled away, the sun was fully up. The neighbors who'd helped fight the fire were starting to leave. The ones who'd come to watch her fail were already gone, probably riding back to tell Kern what he'd already knew. Eli came out of the house, still in his nightclothes, and wrapped his arms around both of them. Are we okay? He asked in a small voice. Mabel looked at her son, then at Garrett, then at her land. The orchard was still standing. The house was still standing. The irrigation system they'd fought so hard to repair was still intact. They'd lost the barn, but they hadn't lost everything. Yeah, she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. We're okay. The sheriff came by later that morning. He walked the burned remains of the barn, asked questions about when they'd noticed the fire, whether they'd seen anyone suspicious. This looks like arson, he said finally. It was arson, Mabel said flatly. You got proof of that? The fire started in 3 different places simultaneously. You can see the burn patterns. That's not an accident. The sheriff nodded slowly. Any idea who might have done it? Yeah, I've got ideas. Mrs. Carter, Douglas Kern has been trying to run me off this land for over a year, Mabel said, not caring anymore about proof or evidence or being careful. He sabotaged my irrigation, he poisoned my grain, he cut my fences, and now he's burned down my barn. Everyone in this valley knows it, including you. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Can you prove any of it? Mabel stared at him. You're not going to do anything, are you? The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Without evidence, rich men get away with anything they want. Mabel's voice was bitter. Is that what you're telling me? I'm telling you I need proof to make an arrest. That's how the law works. Then the law's broken. The sheriff left without making any promises to investigate. Garrett watched him go. He's on Kern's payroll. Probably. Mabel was so tired she could barely stand. Doesn't matter. We know the truth. Truth without justice isn't worth much. No, Mabel agreed, but it's all we've got. They spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could from the barn ruins. Not much survived. Some tools they'd left outside, a few pieces of equipment that had been in the shed instead of the barn. Neighbors brought food, awkward condolences, offers of help. Some of it was genuine. Some of it felt like people covering their bases, making sure they were on record as supportive in case public opinion shifted. Mabel accepted it all with the same tired politeness. By evening, she was running on fumes. Garrett insisted she go inside, take a bath, try to sleep. But when she lay down, her mind wouldn't stop racing. Someone had stood on her property and set fire to her barn while she slept, while her child slept. They could have set fire to the house just as easily, could have killed all 3 of them. The thought made her physically ill. She got up and went to Eli's room. The boy was asleep, finally, his face tear-stained and peaceful. She watched him breathe for a long time, making sure he was real and safe and here. Then she went downstairs to find Garrett sitting at the kitchen table, cleaning his rifle. What are you doing? She asked. Making sure we're ready if they come back. Mabel sat down across from him. You think they will? I think Kern's trying to break you before the wedding. Fire didn't work, so he might try something else. We can't fight him, Garrett. He's got money, power, the law on his side. We've got this. Garrett gestured at the farm outside. We've got land that's producing, contracts with buyers, proof that we can succeed despite everything he's thrown at us. That's power too. It's not enough. Then what is? Garrett set down the rifle and looked at her. What would be enough? Mabel didn't have an answer. They sat in silence for a while. Then Garrett said, We're still getting married in 4 days. Garrett? No. We're not letting him take that too. We planned a wedding. We're having a wedding. Without a barn, without... Mabel gestured helplessly. Everything's falling apart. Then we get married in the ruins, Garrett said fiercely. Right there in the ashes of that barn. Show everyone that fire can't stop us. Fear can't stop us. Nothing Kern does can stop us. We made a promise to each other, and we're keeping it. Mabel stared at him. You're serious? Dead serious. That's crazy. Probably. But it's also the truth. He reached across the table and took her hand. Mabel, we've fought too hard to give up now, and getting married isn't giving up. It's the opposite. It's choosing hope when everything else is trying to make us choose fear. She looked at their joined hands, at the ring he'd made her, still on her finger despite everything. Okay, she whispered. 4 days. In the ashes. Garrett smiled. In the ashes. The next morning, word spread through town that the Carter wedding was still happening. Right on schedule. Right where the barn used to stand. Some people thought it was defiant. Others thought it was insane. Douglas Kern thought it was an opportunity. He called another meeting at his ranch, this time with Vernon Pike, and 2 men Mabel didn't know, hired muscle, rough types who didn't look like ranchers. The wedding's in 4 days, Kern told them. I want it disrupted. I want it humiliated. I want Mabel Carter to look like a fool in front of whatever witnesses she manages to gather. How? One of the hired men asked. I don't care. Get creative. Just make sure it's memorable. Vernon shifted uncomfortably. The fire had been bad enough, but this was crossing into territory that made even him nervous. Douglas, he said carefully, maybe it's time to let this go. She's getting married. She's clearly not selling. Maybe we should what? Kern's voice was ice. Let her win. Let everyone see that I can be beaten by a widow and a drifter? No, this ends at that wedding, one way or another. But what none of them knew was that Hugh Strauss had been watching the ranch from a distance. And when the meeting ended and the hired men left, he followed them. Then he rode straight to the Carter farm to warn Mabel and Garrett what was coming. Because Hugh Strauss might be a coward, but he wasn't a monster, and he'd decided finally which side of that line he wanted to be on. Hugh arrived at the Carter farm just after dark, riding hard enough that his horse was lathered and blowing. Garrett met him at the property line with the rifle, and Hugh raised both hands immediately. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quickly. I'm here to warn you. Mabel came out of the house, and together they listened while Hugh explained what he'd overheard. Kern had hired men to disrupt the wedding. Hugh didn't know the specifics, but he knew it would be bad. How bad? Garrett asked. Bad enough that Kern told them to get creative. Hugh looked genuinely frightened. These aren't ranchers or businessmen. These are the kind of men who hurt people for money. Mabel's stomach turned. He's going to have us attacked at our own wedding. Maybe. Or maybe they'll just destroy what's left of your property while everyone's gathered for the ceremony. I don't know. Hugh met her eyes. But you need to be ready. After Hugh left, Mabel and Garrett sat on the porch steps, trying to process what they'd learned. We could postpone, Garrett said quietly. Wait until things settle down. They're never going to settle down, not while Kern thinks he can win. Mabel's voice was steady despite the fear churning in her gut. We do this now, or we admit he's beaten us. Getting hurt isn't the same as being beaten. No, but running is. She looked at him. I've been running from this fight for over a year, trying to keep my head down, trying not to make waves, hoping if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, people would leave me alone. And you know what? It didn't work. Kern came after me anyway, so maybe it's time to stop running. What are you suggesting? Mabel stood up, her mind working through possibilities. We make the wedding public, really public. Invite everyone in the valley, not just friends. Make it impossible for Kern's men to do anything without witnesses. That puts more people in danger. Or it protects us. Hard to attack someone when 50 people are watching. She turned to face him. And we tell everyone what Kern's done. All of it. The irrigation sabotage, the poisoned grain, the fire. We lay it all out in the open where he can't hide from it. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. That's risky. Everything about this is risky. True enough. He stood beside her. All right, we make it public, but we also make sure we're protected. I'll ask some of the neighbors who helped with the fire to stick around during the ceremony. Men I trust to have our backs if trouble starts. You think they'll do it? Only one way to find out. Over the next 3 days, they worked harder than they'd worked even during the irrigation repair. Mabel rode to every farm within 10 miles, personally inviting people to the wedding. Some were surprised. Others were skeptical. But most agreed to come, if only out of curiosity about what the widow Carter was planning. Garrett recruited a dozen men he'd worked with over the summer, good men who'd helped fight the barn fire, who respected what Mabel had accomplished. He told them the truth about Kern's threats and asked if they'd be willing to watch for trouble during the ceremony. Every single one of them said yes. Eli helped clear the burned timbers from where the barn had stood, creating a space that could hold a crowd. It wasn't pretty. The ground was still charred, ash stains marked the earth, but it was honest, raw proof of what they'd survived. "You sure you want to do this here?" Eli asked, wiping soot from his hands. "In the ruins?" "I'm sure," Mabel said. "This is where we fought hardest. Seems right to make our promises here." The boy thought about that, then nodded. Papa would have liked Garrett. The statement came out of nowhere, and it hit Mabel like a fist to the chest. "You think so?" she managed. "Yeah, Papa always said a man's worth is in his work, not his words. Garrett works hard, doesn't brag, treats people fair." Eli looked up at her. "And he makes you smile again. Papa would have wanted that." Mabel pulled her son into a hug, fighting tears. "I miss your father every day." "Me too." Eli's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "But I'm glad Garrett's here. Is that okay?" "That's more than okay." She pulled back to look at him. "Thomas was a good man, and he'll always be your father. But that doesn't mean we can't love other people too. Love isn't something that runs out." Eli nodded, seeming to understand more than his 9 years should allow. That night, Mabel couldn't sleep. She kept running through scenarios in her head. What if Kern's men showed up with guns? What if they started a fight in front of all those witnesses? What if someone got hurt protecting her? Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. Garrett was at the kitchen table again, this time writing something on a piece of paper. "What's that?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "Vows. Thought I should write some down. Never been married before, don't know the proper words." Mabel sat down across from him. "Can I see?" He hesitated, then slid the paper across the table. The handwriting was rough, unpracticed, but the words were simple and true. "I promise to stand beside you when things are hard, to work the land with you and respect what you've built, to be a father to Eli if he'll have me, to stay, not because I have to, but because I choose to, every day." Mabel read it twice, her throat tight. "It's not fancy," Garrett said, misreading her silence. "I know people usually say prettier things." "It's perfect," Mabel interrupted. "It's exactly right." She hadn't written vows, hadn't thought that far ahead, too focused on just surviving to the wedding day. But sitting here now, looking at this man who'd appeared in her life at the exact moment she needed him most, words started forming. She found paper and began writing. "I promise to trust you, even though trust doesn't come easy anymore. To build a life with you, not because I need rescue, but because I want a partner. To let you be part of this family without forgetting the family I had before. To choose hope over fear, even when fear feels safer." When she finished, Garrett read her words silently. "Think we can keep these promises?" he asked quietly. "I don't know, but I want to try. That's all anyone can do." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Mabel, whatever happens tomorrow—" "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't say goodbye just in case. We're going to get through this." "How do you know?" "Because we've gotten through everything else." She squeezed his hand. "And because I'm not ready to give up on happy endings yet." The wedding day dawned clear and warm. Mabel woke early and dressed carefully in the only good dress she owned. Dark green, simple, nothing fancy. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it would have to do. She pinned her hair up, put on the ring Garrett had made, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired, older than her 32 years, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Strength, maybe. Or just stubbornness. Either way, she'd take it. Downstairs, Eli was already dressed in his Sunday clothes, fidgeting with his collar. Garrett wore clean trousers and a shirt Mabel had mended for him the week before. He'd shaved, combed his hair back. He looked nervous. "You ready?" she asked him. "No," he admitted. "You?" "Not even a little." They smiled at each other, and some of the tension eased. People started arriving around noon, more people than Mabel had expected. Neighbors from every direction, people she'd known for years, and people she'd only met once or twice. They came out of curiosity, out of support, out of the simple human desire to witness something that mattered. Amos Reed came with his wife. The grain buyer who'd given Mabel a fair price came with his family. Even some of the women who'd gossiped about her showed up, looking slightly ashamed but there nonetheless. The men Garrett had recruited positioned themselves casually around the property's edges, watching the road. They looked relaxed, but Mabel could see the tension in their shoulders. By 1 o'clock, maybe 60 people had gathered in and around the burned barn foundation, and still no sign of Kern's hired men. Mabel started to hope they wouldn't come, that maybe Hugh had been wrong, or maybe Kern had changed his mind. Then she saw the dust on the road, 3 riders approaching from the south. Not the hired thugs Hugh had described. These were ranchers, men she recognized. Douglas Kern, Vernon Pike, and Hugh Strauss. The crowd went quiet as they rode up to the property line. Kern dismounted with the arrogance of someone who thought he owned the world. Vernon followed. Hugh stayed on his horse, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Mrs. Carter," Kern called out. "Didn't think you'd go through with it."
"Then you don't know me very well,"
Mabel replied. She walked forward to meet him, Garrett at her side. The witnesses pressed closer, sensing confrontation. "This is private property," Garrett said quietly. "You're not invited." "Actually, the invitation said everyone in the valley was welcome," Kern said with a cold smile. "I'm just taking the widow at her word." "What do you want, Kern?" Mabel asked. "To bear witness. To see if you actually have the nerve to go through with this farce." His eyes swept over the burned barn ruins, the watching crowd. "Though I have to say, choosing this location is tasteless, even for you." "Tasteless would be burning down someone's barn 4 days before their wedding," Mabel said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you'd know more about that than I would." The crowd murmured. Kern's expression darkened. "Careful, Mrs. Carter. Accusations like that require proof." "Do they?" Mabel stepped closer. "Then let's talk about proof. Let's talk about how you paid Vernon Pike to lie about my irrigation system, how you sabotaged my grain crop, how you've spent the last year trying to destroy my farm so you could buy it for nothing." "That's slander," Vernon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Mabel turned to the crowd. "How many of you have had Vernon inspect your land? How many of you got advice that seemed off? Problems that got worse instead of better after he visited?" Several hands went up slowly, then more. Kern's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. I came here to—" "You came here to intimidate me," Mabel interrupted. "One last time, one last attempt to make me feel small and scared and alone. But you're too late, Mr. Kern. I'm not alone anymore." She gestured to the crowd, to Garrett, to Eli standing with Amos Reed, to the men watching the property's edges. "These people know what you've done. Some of them helped you do it. But they're here anyway, because deep down, even the ones who gossiped and judged and looked the other way know that what you did was wrong." Hugh Strauss climbed down from his horse. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "I was part of it. The irrigation scheme, the planning to buy her land cheap. I helped Kern, and I'm not proud of it. But she's right. It was wrong." Vernon looked like he wanted to disappear. Several people in the crowd were staring at him with new understanding, putting pieces together. Kern's face was red now, fury barely controlled. "You've got no proof of any of this." "I have my farm," Mabel said simply. "Thriving, productive, profitable, despite everything you threw at it. That's all the proof I need. The law hasn't helped me yet, but maybe that'll change now that everyone knows what kind of man you really are." Kern took a step toward her, and immediately Garrett moved between them. So did 3 other men from the crowd. For a moment, violence hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Then Reverend Matthews stepped forward. The old pastor looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Kern, I think it's time you left." "This doesn't concern you, Reverend." "Doesn't it? You pressured me not to perform this ceremony, made it sound like I'd be endorsing sin. But looking at these 2 people," he gestured to Mabel and Garrett, "I don't see sin. I see courage, and I'm ashamed I let you make me doubt that." More voices joined in. "Time to go, Kern. You're not welcome here. We know what you did." The tide had turned. and Kern knew it. He stared at Mabel with pure hatred, then remounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Mabel replied quietly. "It is. You lost, Mr. Kern, and everyone here knows it." Kern, Vernon, and Hugh rode away. But as they left, Hugh looked back once, and Mabel thought she saw something like regret in his expression. The crowd was buzzing now, people talking in low voices about what they'd just witnessed. Reverend Matthews approached Mabel and Garrett. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have had more faith. In you, and in what's right." "You're here now," Mabel said. "That's what matters. Would you—" The Reverend paused. "Would you still want me to perform the ceremony? I'd understand if you'd rather—" "We'd be honored," Garrett said, speaking for both of them. The Reverend nodded, relief clear on his face. They gathered in the center of the burned barn foundation, surrounded by 60 witnesses and the ghosts of everything they'd survived. Reverend Matthews kept it simple, asked if they'd come freely to this marriage, asked if they'd honor and cherish each other. When it came time for vows, Garrett pulled out his paper and read in a voice that shook slightly but never wavered. Mabel recited hers from memory, looking directly at Garrett as she spoke. The Reverend asked for rings. Mabel had the one Garrett made. Garrett produced a simple band he'd bought in town with the last of his saved money. They exchanged them with hands that trembled. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Matthews said, "I pronounce you husband and wife." Garrett kissed Mabel in the ashes of the barn someone had burned to break them, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Eli ran up and threw his arms around both of them, grinning so wide his face might split. People came forward to congratulate them, to apologize for doubting, to offer help rebuilding the barn. The mood shifted from tense confrontation to genuine celebration. Someone had brought food, someone else had brought whiskey. Tables appeared from wagon beds, and suddenly it was a real wedding reception happening right there in the ruins. Mabel stood with Garrett's arm around her waist, watching her neighbors celebrate, and felt something settle in her chest. This was what victory looked like. Not perfect, not pretty, but real. Later, as the sun started to set and people began heading home, Amos Reed pulled Mabel aside. "I talked to the sheriff," he said quietly. "Told him what I heard from Kern, what Hugh confessed to today. He's not happy about it, but with all these witnesses, he's going to have to investigate." "Will anything come of it?" Amos shrugged. "Maybe not legally. Rich men have ways of avoiding consequences, but everyone knows the truth now. That matters." "Does it?" "Yeah," Amos said firmly. "It does. Kern's reputation is ruined. People won't trust him the same way. Won't do business with him without thinking twice. That's not justice exactly, but it's something." Mabel nodded. It wasn't enough, but maybe nothing would be. Maybe sometimes you just had to accept that survival was its own kind of revenge. As the last guests left, Mabel, Garrett, and Eli stood together looking at their land. "So what now?" Eli asked. "Now we rebuild," Garrett said. "Barn first, then whatever else needs fixing. And then?" "Then we keep going," Mabel said, "one day at a time." The next few months proved harder than the wedding day. Word spread about what had happened, and while some people sided with Mabel, others thought she'd been disrespectful to drag Kern's name through the mud publicly. The valley divided into factions, and old friendships fractured along new lines. Kern didn't attack them again directly, but he made life difficult in other ways. He bought out competitors so Mabel had fewer options for selling her crops. He spread rumors about the quality of her grain. He made sure every business transaction was harder than it needed to be. But he couldn't stop the land from producing. By fall, the orchard yielded the biggest apple crop in 5 years. The grain came in strong despite the sabotage section. Buyers from outside the valley, unaffected by Kern's influence, paid premium prices for the quality. Mabel paid off the remaining debts and had money left over. They rebuilt the barn together, all 3 of them, with help from neighbors who showed up on weekends. It wasn't as big as the old one, but it was sturdy, built to last. Garrett officially adopted Eli that winter. The paperwork was simple, but the meaning was profound. The boy took Hale as his middle name, keeping Carter as his last name to honor his blood father while acknowledging his new one. The night the adoption was finalized, Eli asked Garrett, "Does this mean you can't leave now? Like, legally?" "I couldn't leave before," Garrett said. "But, yeah, now it's official." "Good." Eli hugged him hard. Because I like having a father again. Life settled into a rhythm. Not easy, never easy, but manageable. Mabel learned to trust again, slowly. To believe that Garrett wouldn't disappear, that happiness didn't always end in loss. It took time, and there were days when the old fear crept back in. But Garrett was patient with her uncertainty, and gradually it faded. Garrett learned what it meant to have roots. To wake up in the same place every morning and call it home. To have people who depended on him not just for work, but for love. It scared him sometimes, but he stayed anyway. Eli grew taller, stronger, more confident. He learned the farm inside and out, worked alongside Garrett with the easy partnership of family. Sometimes he still talked about Thomas, keeping those memories alive. But he built new memories, too. Years passed. Douglas Kern's influence gradually waned. People remembered what he'd done, and even if they couldn't prove it legally, they stopped trusting him. His business dealings suffered. He grew bitter and isolated, watching the Carter farm thrive while his own holdings stagnated. Vernon Pike left the valley entirely, unable to face the people he'd lied to. Hugh Strauss became an unexpected ally. He testified honestly about Kern's schemes when the sheriff finally investigated, even though it cost him friendships and business relationships. He never became close with Mabel, but there was respect between them. The respect of two people who'd both made mistakes and were trying to do better. 5 years after the wedding, Mabel stood in the orchard during harvest time, watching Garrett and Eli load apples into crates. The trees were heavy with fruit, branches bending under the weight. The irrigation system hummed smoothly in the background. She thought about the woman she'd been when Garrett first arrived. Desperate, exhausted, convinced she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. She'd been wrong about that, not because everything worked out perfectly, not because the bad guys faced justice or the town fully accepted her choices, but because she'd learned something important. Survival wasn't about never getting knocked down. It was about getting back up, about choosing to rebuild even when burning everything down would be easier, about trusting people again even after being betrayed, about finding strength not in being invulnerable, but in being willing to be vulnerable anyway. The land had taught her that. This stubborn, difficult, beautiful land that refused to die no matter how many people tried to kill it. Garrett caught her watching and walked over, leaving Eli to finish loading the wagon. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," she smiled. "Just thinking. About? About how I thought I was done when you showed up, thought I'd already lost everything that mattered. And now? Now I know better." She leaned against him. "Turns out you can lose everything and still find reasons to keep going. You can be broken and still be whole. You can start over and have it mean something." Garrett kissed the top of her head. "That's pretty wise for a farmer." Farmers are the wisest people around. We have to be, to keep doing this year after year. They stood together watching the sun set over the valley, over the land they'd fought for and earned and kept despite everyone who said they couldn't. Eli finished with the wagon and came running over. At 14, he was almost as tall as Garrett, all long limbs and energy. "Wagon's loaded," he announced. "We taking it to town tomorrow?" "First thing in the morning," Mabel confirmed. "Can I drive?" Garrett raised an eyebrow. "You even know how to handle a team that size?" "You could teach me," Eli said hopefully. "I suppose I could." Garrett tried to look stern and failed. "All right, tomorrow morning we'll practice before we head out." Eli whooped and ran off toward the house. "You're soft on him," Mabel said, amused. "He's a good kid. He's earned a little softness." They walked back to the house together, their shadows long in the evening light. That night, lying in bed, Mabel thought about the future for the first time in years without fear attached to it. There would be more hard seasons, more droughts or floods or disasters they couldn't predict. There would be people who resented their success, who waited for them to fail. The farm would always be work, endless and demanding. But they'd face it together, her, Garrett, Eli. A family built not from blood or tradition, but from choice and work and stubborn refusal to give up. That was worth more than anything she'd lost. The next morning, they took the apple harvest to town. Eli drove the wagon with Garrett beside him, giving instructions. Mabel rode behind them on horseback, watching her son handle the reins with growing confidence. They sold the entire load within 2 hours. Buyers competed for the Carter apples now, knowing they were the best in the valley. As Mabel counted the money, she saw Douglas Kern across the street. He looked older, smaller somehow. diminished by his own bitterness. Their eyes met for a moment. She waited for the anger, the hatred, the desire for revenge, but all she felt was pity. He'd wanted her land so badly he'd destroyed himself trying to take it, and in the end, all he had was the knowledge that she'd beaten him. She turned away without acknowledging him and went to find her family. That evening, they had supper together at the kitchen table, just the three of them, like always. Eli was excited about learning to drive the wagon. Garrett was planning next year's planting rotation. Mabel was calculating whether they could afford to expand the grain operation. Normal life. Beautiful, ordinary, hard-earned, normal life. After Eli went to bed, Mabel and Garrett sat on the porch like they did most nights. "You ever regret it?" Mabel asked. "Stopping here instead of moving on?" Garrett thought about it. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept writing that day, where I'd be now. And then I look at this." He gestured at the farm, the house, the life they'd built. "And I know exactly where I'd be. Alone. Still running. Still thinking the next place might be the one where I finally felt like I belonged." "You belong here," Mabel said quietly. "Yeah, I do." He took her hand. "Took me 35 years to find home, but I found it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies blink across the orchard. Somewhere in the valley, Douglas Kern sat in his big empty house, surrounded by land he'd acquired through schemes and pressure and cruelty, and felt nothing but hollow victory. Somewhere else, Hugh Strauss worked his own farm, carrying the weight of his mistakes but trying to be better. And in town, people who'd gossiped about the widow Carter now told their children stories about the woman who refused to break, who rebuilt after every disaster, who chose love over fear and made it work. The story changed depending on who told it. Some versions made Mabel a hero. Others made her stubborn and difficult. Some focused on the romance, others on the revenge. But they all agreed on one thing: the Carter farm had survived. And that survival meant something. Years later, when Eli was grown and running the farm himself, when Mabel and Garrett were old and gray and still working the land side by side, people would still point to that property and remember. Remember that sometimes the broken things are worth fixing. That starting over doesn't mean forgetting what came before. That family is something you build, not just something you're born into. That love isn't always romantic or easy, but it's worth fighting for anyway. That land can be healed if you're willing to do the work. That giving up is always easier than staying, but staying is what matters. The Carter farm stood as proof of all of it. 40 acres of stubborn, difficult, beautiful proof that survival is its own kind of victory. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the orchard was heavy with fruit and the irrigation system hummed its endless song, Mabel would sit on her porch and think about the woman she'd been that day when a stranger rode up her drive and offered to fix what was broken. She'd been so afraid then, so convinced that trusting anyone would only lead to more pain. But she'd taken the risk anyway. And that single moment of courage, of choosing possibility over certainty, of opening the gate when every instinct screamed to keep it closed, had changed everything. Not perfectly, not without cost, but changed it nonetheless. The farm she'd fought for, the man she'd married, the family they'd built together, the life that kept going season after season because they chose to make it keep going. That was the real story. Not the dramatic confrontations or the barn burning or the wedding in the ashes. Those were just moments, peaks in a long, ordinary life of work and love and choosing each other every single day. The real story was in the choosing. And Mabel Carter, who'd been widowed and targeted and broken and rebuilt, who'd learned to trust again after every reason not to, who'd turned a failing farm into a thriving legacy, she'd made the right choice. Not because everything worked out perfectly, but because she'd decided it was worth trying. And in the end, that made all the difference.